Good morning, everyone. I am Flor Delisa Gumahog II, and I am the chosen reporter for the Article 1157. So we have 5 obligations. The first one is law, the second one is contracts, the third one is quasi-contracts, and the fourth one is acts or omission punished by law, and the last one is quasi-delect. So, ito yung 5 sources kung bakit tayo nagkakaroon ng obligation. So, first, we will tackle the obligation arise from law when imposed by law itself. So, meaning, nagkakaroon tayo ng obligation kapag yung law na yon ay nakasaad na i-fulfill yung isang obligation. So, we have 2 examples of obligation, the tax code and the family code. Ang tax code, yung pagbabayad natin sa tax, nasa law na yon. And then for the family code, or take care of the family, hindi ibig sabihin na sinasabi natin na mahal natin yung parents natin or ang anak natin, ay hindi na yun batas. Nasa batas din natin na we need to take care of our parents. The second one is the obligation arising from contracts. A contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to other to give something or to render some service, must be complied within the good faith because it is the law. Between parties, neither party may unilaterally evade his obligation in the contract unless, which means nagkakaroon ng agreement between 2 person and 2 party na nagkasundo sa condition for their contracts. At sa contracts na yun, it's either give something or render something to do or not to do. At sabi din dito ay must be complied within the good faith, meaning kailangan sundin yung terms and condition or stipulation na nasa contract. So, bawal daw takasan yung obligation. Bawal takasan ng isang party unless pinayagan siya ng contract na wag gawin yung isang bagay or merong other party na sumali doon sa contract. Kaya siguro hindi na sinusunod ang kanyang obligation. So, kailangan nila magkaroon ng agreement. So, we have note for the obligation arising from contract. Parties may freely enter into any stipulation provided they are not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. So, sabi dito, freely enter, paggawa ng contract. Walang namang bayad yon or hindi pinagbabawal hanggat yung contract na yon ay hindi naman labag sa batas or nakakasira ng integrity and for safety na rin sa mga tao. Kaya pwede gumawa ng contract for 2 party. So, I have an example here. The obligation to repay a loan or indebtedness by virtue of an agreement. So, for the obligation arising from quasi-contracts, arise from lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts in which are enforceable to the end that no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. So, take note, dito, unilateral acts, meaning walang meeting of minds between 2 party kasi unilateral, one lang. Pero meron pa ring obligation and yung obligation natin, no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. So, para mas maintindihan, ito yung example natin. So, for the A is negotiatorium gesture, unauthorized management. This takes place when a person voluntarily takes charge of another's abandoned business or property without the owner's authority. Okay, example. Yuna took care of Sister Lily's dog while she's away. It is her obligation to reimburse him the necessary expenses he incurred. Yung dog ni Sister Lily ay naiwan niya habang siya ay nagbabakasyon. But Yuna took care of his dog. So, kailangan bayaran ni Sister Lily si Yuno sa mga nagastos niya dito para sa kanyang dog. So, silang dalawa ay naka-benefits. So, the question is, why Sister Lily needs to pay Yuno? Kasi nga, sabi dito sa arising quasi-contracts, no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. So, dito di ba nga, dahil inalagaan ni Yuno yung aso ni Sister Lily, edi buhay pa yung aso. So, basically speaking, ang benefits dito, si Sister Lily by having her dog alive. And si Yun naman is inherent sa law na siya ang gumastos sa dog. Sabi nga sa ating quasi-contract, no one shall be benefited for another. So, dapat dito equal lang palagi. So, di ba nga si Sister Lily nag-benefit siya dahil buhay pa yung aso. And then si Yuna naman is siya ay binayaran ni Sister Lily. Okay, let's proceed for the second example. For the second example is solutio indebiti. Undue payment. This takes place when something is received when there is no right to demand it and it was unduly delivered through mistake. For example, Tanjiro received excessive change after buying from Nizuku stores. It is his obligation to return his excessive change. So, di ba nga, sobra yung sukli ni Tanjiro. So, sa kanya ba yung pera? Di ba hindi? So, kailangan niya yung ibalik kasi yun na nga, kailangan niya yung ibalik yung pera dahil nasa arising quasi-contracts natin na no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. So, hindi naman sa kanya yun. So, kailangan niya yung ibalik. Kasi, kung hindi niya yung ibabalik, meron tayong unreasonable. Kasi bawal daw ang benefits expense another. Nasa law natin yun. So, those are the example of the quasi-contracts. So, next is obligation arising from the lex. The lex, it is a crimes or acts punishable by law. So, when they arise from civil liability, which is the consequence of a criminal offense, produced both criminal and civil liability. For example, the obligation of a thief to return the car stolen by him, the duty of a killer to identify the heirs of the victim. So, sa example natin, makikita dun ang dalawa ang kanyang obligation. So, the first one is kailangan niya yung ibalik ang car na kinuha niya at yung isa naman ay obligation niya based sa criminal liability kasi ang pagnanakaw ay nasa law natin yun. So, for the obligation of the lex, hindi natin masyado tatalakayin ng criminal liability dahil magpo-focus tayo sa civil liability. So, obligation na nagmumula sa mga crime, murder, theft, and many more. Okay, for the last example is obligation arising from causa de lex. When they arise from damage caused to another through an act or omission, there being fault or negligence, but no contractual relation exists between the parties. So, for example, because of the organizer negligence, audience were hurt during an event. So, obligation of the organizer to pay the medical expenses. So, balikan natin tong definition sa quasi de lex. Damage caused for another through an act or omission. There being fault or negligence. So, meaning, isa siyang act na nagkaroon ng damage sa isang parties. Dahil ito sa kapabayaan o negligence pero wala namang kontrata between two parties. So, look at the example. Wala naman ditong kontrata na si organizer ang dapat magbayad sa medical expenses sa guest natin. Pero dahil napatunayan na nasaktan si audience because of the negligence o kapabayaan ng ating organizer, it is the obligation of the organizer to pay for the medical expenses. So, ayan. Kapag napatunayan sa ating mga cases na negligence sa ating party kung ang dahilan na naging damage sa other party, it is obligation ng isang party na i-consolidate na what you call this money based dun sa katumbas ng damage. So dito sa quasi de lex, always remember the words negligent. So, there must be fault of negligence attribute to the offended. There must be damage or injury caused to another. There is no pre-existing contracts. So, that's all for the Article 1157. Thank you and God bless, and I hope you learned something.